Thank you very much for having me here at Clarity 16 in Chicago. So a brief introduction of myself. I've been working since 1994 up to 2016. I started out my career as a chemist, but by 1997 I became a web designer and web developer. And I learned how to do SEO sometime after being a developer in 2004. Played around with some social and PPC depending on my different roles in agencies. It was just in 2015 where I decided to go in-house, not really into an agency type of company. There was times where I was employed or when I was self-employed, and nearly half of my career life is in the Philippines and half is in the United States. I had fun in Chicago. I came in 2 days earlier before Clarity 16, went around downtown, went to all the scenic spots, did the bus tour, the river tour, and I had fun over here. So let's just go straight into the topics. AngularJS, pleasing users, search engines developers, and SEO. Now, I also have the topic of schema later on, so I might be talking a bit fast so that we could cover a lot of material. So AngularJS, why and why not? So different people have different roles. They look at AngularJS in different ways. So AngularJS and developers, basically what they like here is there's less code, there's data binding, there's the MVC framework, DOM control, development time is generally shorter because they could make code shorter. They have reusable elements. DOM control is mainly controlling each and every element within the HTML code, every tag, every attribute. Model view controller is basically you're splitting up, the model, the view, and the controller. Elements that are specifically for programming in the logic alone, and elements that are specifically for displaying how a page looks like. Data binding, if you're gonna look at it, there's pages that you could update data after a page reload, while in data binding, things almost happen in real time. You're entering something in a form field and it updates the code, what is displayed on the page instantaneously. So that's just my one sentence descriptions of each item here. Users, why do they like it? It loads fast. It appears like it's a desktop application. It doesn't have to reload the page, which is a general trait of Ajax. Search engines. There could be some issues here with search engines because search engines may not see the content and may not see the links. However, Google has expressed in the past that they do have a headless browser, that they can understand JavaScript. But based on experience, testimonies also with other SEOs aside from myself, where there are cases where Google can't see the content that is generated by JavaScript, and AngularJS is basically content that is generated by JavaScript. So in SEO's point of view, we don't necessarily say, Angular is bad or what. There's just some extra steps that are needed to make sure that your AngularJS pages are crawlable and visible to search engines. So that is one reason why SEOs kind of dislike it, because there's additional work that is needed. Now, is this only applicable to AngularJS? Actually, no. There are many JavaScript frameworks aside from Angular. Angular is just one of them. And what I'm going to go through here is also applicable to other frameworks. Here are just some logos of the ones that are also JS frameworks. Maybe some of them you recognize: React, Ember, Meteor, Backbone, Polymer, Knockout. And there's more out there. So for our discussion, I have a sample site, and here's the sample site that we're going to use. I have a URL shortener, and we could simply visit that so you have an idea how it looks like. So this is the sample site that we're going to work on, and we're going to do some examples on. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, this was specifically made for showing issues with SEO. It is not intended to do a tutorial on how to build an Angular site. The example is based on this tutorial, and if we visit that tutorial is this blog post. It's made by Charney K. Hopefully I am pronouncing that properly. He does have a tutorial on how to make a simple Angular website from scratch. And I just used that same tutorial to use as an example for this presentation. If ever you want to build one from scratch and use a similar example, then you could simply visit that site and go through it. Now, the main thing I want to point out here is, if you notice, as you go on the different pages, the URL is not changing before the hashtag or the hash in the URL. Or some people like calling it, the number sign, the pound sign, the sharp symbol. Same thing, we'll call it the hash. And the only thing that is changing is at the right side of it, meaning it's loading the exact same page, and this is a single page application. The contents on that single page is what is changing. So in the technical implementation of SEO, I'm going to go through a very brief overview on each and every method that I have to solve SEO issues on Angular sites. And the first way is to not use AngularJS at all. Self-explanatory. It's one of the solutions. Less exciting because you're not really touching Angular anymore. Now, the other way is, if you still have to use AngularJS, my second method is to use a static site equivalent. And I will explain that further in the following slides. Another one is initial static HTML rendering. And then the fourth one is using pre-rendered JS code, which I further subdivide into two, either by using a headless browser or using a pre-rendering service. So let's go into each one. With the sample Angular site that we're using in discussion, if you look into that source code, you can't see the content and you cannot see the links. So just to briefly go through that, this was the example sample site. And I'm going to click through services. I'm going to click through about. You could see welcome to modern business. Control U to view the source code, and you don't even see it. I'll zoom out a bit, and you could see this is how short the source code is. Here's the opening body tag. Here's the closing body tag. There's some div tags here, and that is where our content's supposed to be. And yet we don't see it. We don't see any of this content. As I click around FAQs, we don't see any of that content. I'll view the source code of this page. Again, where is that content? It is not present. So that is what I mainly wanted to show. And that is where search engines have a hard time sometimes seeing that content. Sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't. It is very inconsistent. So if you're going to look at the solution, the first solution of to don't use AngularJS, pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to open the sample of the solution. I'm going to click around, and I'm going to click through these links. And on these links, you could see that there are individual pages, and I don't have the hash in the URL. There's individual folders and individual files. So when I go on one page, and you could see the source code, when I visit it, you could see that the source is there. I have my links in the navigation, and then I start to have my content, and you could see that the content is there. Okay, so that point we already know, pretty straightforward. You could see the content. Now, that is not that exciting though, because we are not using AngularJS anymore. But if we do it that way, search engines would be happy, SEOs would be happy, developers would be not so happy, and the users would be, I don't really know if I should be happy or not. And the main reason is developers is, if ever they invested their time in building a site that is using Angular, and then suddenly they have to redo the site again, then of course they're not that happy. And once you do it in plain HTML, with the CMS or not, generally it's gonna use more steps for the developer to create more pages. The users, they don't really know if it affects them or not. But there are some certain AngularJS sites wherein it affects the user experience. And if it affects the user experience and it makes it better for conversion and sales, then Angular is important to use. So those are some things to consider before recommending just saying don't use Angular at all. Sometimes that is not always the best solution. Now, on my second solution is to use a static equivalent site. What is this? You have to use AngularJS, and you also have to use static HTML. Now, the AngularJS makes users happy, they have that user experience of how Angular works. It loads fast, feels like a desktop application. They are very happy. Search engines are happy because they see the static site, wherein server-side scripting is applied, where that means that the code is rendered on the server, not on the browser. So they see that content. But there are some problems here. What is the main problem? The problem is links could go to the AngularJS site, and when links go there, search engines might see the site that was intended for the users. Likewise, links could also go to the static equivalent. And if links go there, then users might be following those links and seeing the static site. Now, they might be seeing the sites that were not intended for them. So the solution there is, if search engines go to the Angular one, we could 301 redirect that to the static version. And if users end up on the static version, you could create links that make them go back to the Angular site. Okay, to understand this further, let's go to the example. Okay, here's the example. In this example, I'm going to simply click around. You could see services, pricing table, about, FAQs, etc., etc. So it doesn't look any different from the Angular version. But what are search engines seeing? What search engines are seeing is something else. Okay, so let me just view the source code, and I want to point out a tag here. I'm going to simply zoom in, and the first tag you're going to see is this fragment exclamation point. This fragment meta tag, what does this do? When Google sees this, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to replace the pound symbol into what? It's simply replacing this into a question mark and then underscore escaped fragment underscore equals. That is what it is doing. It's simply gonna change the pound symbol into that. Again, once this tag is found, it's replacing the hash symbol into this. Load that up, and you would see the source code now is different. You could see the source in there. So let's try doing that on the actual page. And this is what Google is seeing. Okay, they are now seeing a different page. Now, if I click around, it goes back to the JavaScript version, to the Ajax version. But every time it goes there, it has the hash symbol. All of them have the escape fragment tag. So what Google is seeing is the static version. Okay. So what is happening here? Let's go back to the presentation. Once the tag is found, this is fired in the URL, and once this get variable, it turns into a get variable, is detected, the page will automatically 301 redirect to the static version. So this is intended for users, but when search engines see it, they automatically get 301 redirected to the static version. Now, what do users see? When I was clicking around, you automatically saw it go back to the Angular site. What is happening here is, if we're going to view the source code again, let's go here to the services. This is the static services page, as you could see there in the URL. I view the source code. You don't see the hash fragment because this is the static version. But when you go down to the links, you would notice the tag. The tag has an href attribute with the value of the static pages. These are the URLs which search engines would crawl. But additionally, I have an on-click event handler on JavaScript, which is just simply saying that if a user clicks on the link, you are going to open the AngularJS version. The return false simply means when it's clicked on, don't load the href value. Instead, when it's clicked on, just load the Angular version. Okay? So, if we're looking at this about link, I hover over it, you could see the href value on the lower left of the screen. On the lower left, the about, you could see that the about URL is there. If I click on it though, it's not going to go to that URL. Instead, it's going to load the AngularJS version. So that is mainly what is happening. If I go back to the presentation, so the main thing here is to keep the href values going to the static pages, because that is what search engines will crawl. Use the onClick window.location href, because that is what users would see, and then add the return false so it doesn't execute the href value. Okay, so as a summary, it uses Angular, which is for users. It uses the static, which is for search engines. But if search engines land on the Angular, they automatically 301 redirect to the static. And if users see the static, for every click they click on, it goes back to the Angular. So that is the second method of static equivalent site. Disadvantage is sometimes you build two sites. It's like double the work. Now, the next one I'm going to recommend is using what I call initial static HTML rendering. This is very similar to what I was talking about earlier on the static site equivalent. The difference is we kind of merge these into one. So how does that actually happen? Now that you have the static HTML server-side scripting along with AngularJS together, how does that look like in the source code? Here is the source code, how it looks like for the Angular version. And this was screenshotted from my HTML editor. That header line basically pulls data from that header.html. The footer line pulls the information from that footer.html. Now that middle area under ng-view, what appears there is any of these HTML files. Now this is just an example where I'm pulling it from static HTML files. In actual real websites, some of them might be pulling it from a database, an XML file, a MySQL database. It could be pulled a JSON file from wherever, whatever format you have. For simplicity purposes, I'm just pulling them from static HTML. Now, all of that happens on the client side. So the information is not really in the source code. It happens on the browser when these pages are pulled in or these other files are pulled in. Now, what I am recommending how to do this on the server is to have server-side scripting. What is server-side scripting? Meaning the code runs on the server. And you could see here there is a PHP line. PHP is a server-side scripting language. Again, you could use any server-side scripting language of your choice. This PHP is just used for example purposes. You could use Node if you want. You could use Python. You could use .NET, whatever it is you prefer using, Cold Fusion, Perl, or something. Okay, so just to give you a quick idea of each line, this is still the Angular line, but inside the tag is a PHP line that is saying pull in the header on the server side. So it's going to be rendered as plain HTML when viewed in the browser. The same here on the footer. Now in the middle, it is dependent on the URL. Okay, there is a request URI, which is basically your the path after the first slash. Okay, after the first slash of after the domain. So how does that look like? Let's just go here. So this is the page. This is the home page. If we're going to view the source code of the home page, you should be able to see the source code. You do see the content there, the links, and you do see the content. See, Bootstrap 3 built. And if you see here, Bootstrap 3 built. So that source code is definitely there. If I click on services, let me close that source code. I clicked on services, pricing table. You could see it's loading AngularJS. The URL is not changing. So technically, this should still be the home page. If I click on about, this should still be the home page. Let's view the source code. And after briefly browsing down, you could see Bootstrap 3 built. That was part of the home page earlier. Now let's check this. It's nice to meet you. And let's go to the source code and let's find it. It is not found. So clearly what we're on does have static content. It has static content for search engines. The content is changing for the users, but it is not changing for the search engines because the URL is not really changing. This is after the pound symbol, which means it's still loading the exact same page, but the contents of the page is changing. So what are search engines seeing if we right click on this and open in a new tab? What does that actually do? It's reading the href value. So let's go into the source code, and I went to the services link. Just to give you an idea, services link. There is an href value and there's an onClick, similar to the ones that we did earlier. This is onClick is for the users, href is for the search engines. This is what the search engines would open. So let's just open that. And this is what the search engines are seeing. We are now on the services page. Okay, so what we do should be in the source code. We view it, search it, it is there, what we do. Now, if I click around, let's say I go to About, this should not be here because I am still on the services page. Let's give that, search services, or what we do. Yep, it is still there. Even though I'm seeing it's nice to meet you, and let's search that in the source code, it is not there. Why? Because I am still on the services page. Hopefully that is somewhat clear, but basically the static and the Angular load at the same time in a single page. Search engines see the static version, users see the Angular version. When a user clicks on a link, they're going to see the Angular version changing. When search engines crawl the links, they're going to continue to see the static version. I would say that I prefer this one as the best method, simply because there's no additional plugin, nothing additional to install. You're still working on one site, you're not working on two, but there's just some additional code on how it's built. So to explain that further, other pages of the site, when they're linked to other pages of the site, what is happening? The Angular version looks like this, but these are the changes we made, and I explained this earlier. href value is for the search engines, onClick is for the users. Now let's go on to the next method, using a headless browser by pre-rendering JS code. There's another way to pre-render it, but we'll tackle that second. So the first one is you have an AngularJS site, just like all the other situations. We also have the fragment tag, but we use a headless browser. In this specific case, we use Phantom.js. Just to be clear, a headless browser is a browser without a user interface. Okay, now in this headless browser, we have the escape fragment. It does the exact same thing. The only difference is when that get variable is in the URL, the escape underscore fragment underscore, it triggers to run the headless browser. Now, here is that example. So here it is. We do have that. And again, we have the escape fragment tag in there. So what does that mean? It changes the pound sign into question mark escape fragment equals. So this is now the version that search engines are seeing. How does it actually look like in the source code? Headless browsers means it's gonna render the page how it is displayed in a browser. So it happened on the server, it rendered the JavaScript code. You could see the links, you could see the content that wasn't there because it acted like a browser on the server. It ran it and it put it in there. You might see some extra styles in there, and the only reason why they're there because it's acting like a browser, and these were browser-specific instructions. So that is why you see that. So every page is still the headless browser, the Angular version. If I go to one of these links, that is the Angular version, again, the source code, you won't see the content, but they do have the escape fragment. So if the escape fragment is there, again, we're going to replace that pound symbol, into this, and this is what appears, and that is what search engines are seeing. Let's view the source code for the search engine, and again, you see the source code. Okay, so this is somewhat pretty straightforward once you install the headless browser and configure the headless browser properly. Once those are installed, it becomes straightforward from there. You just have to add this tag, and then you have to tell search engines to run the headless browser. So looking at that from a coding perspective, I do have a server-side line there. I made it in PHP that is just specifically saying if I see the escape fragment get variable in the URL, what do I do? I load the AngularJS. Oh, if it doesn't exist, the exclamation point. If it doesn't exist, I load the normal JS code. But at the very bottom, and that is if the escape fragment does exist, what am I going to do? I'm going to basically load my pre-renderer using Phantom.js, which is mainly part of that loadpage.js. What happens in loadpage.js, it simply loads the exact page that I was loading using the headless browser. So pretty straightforward. Now the next part is using pre-rendering services. Now this is also pre-rendering, but you don't need to install a headless browser. Instead, you have to use the service of another company. Okay? In theory, it runs exactly the same way. So here in the prerender.io, it does the exact same thing as the headless browser. It does the exact same thing. The only thing different is you're using a service that is outside of your server. Just to see how that source code typically looks like. It requires some middleware, and that middleware is something that you install on your server. It has different code versions, and you use the one that is easiest for you to implement. Now, on there, once you have that, what this is simply doing, it's doing a URL rewrite. So when the escape fragment is loading, it's going to pull the page from prerender.io. And in prerender.io, you have some kind of token that kind of identifies that you're the owner of the account. It's gonna, once that is determined, it's now gonna push the required content for your page, which they have crawled and pre-rendered all the JavaScript code from there. So if we're gonna compare these three, the developer, why do they like AngularJS? Because they have control over the document object model, the data binding, easy form validation. They could group HTML into reusable components. Why do SEOs dislike it? Because search engines typically do not read JavaScript code, and Google, that claims they could crawl content with the headless browser, seems to be doing it inconsistently. Now for users, it's like whatever, dude, because they don't even know if you're using Angular or not. They don't even care. What they care about is that the page loads fast, acts like a desktop application, there's no page reloading, it makes them happy. And for the search engine side, as long as they rank high and it's the top result and they like the top result that is favorable for them, then they would also like that. Now, for the first one though, that is somewhat related to what the developer needs to do. For the second one, that is related to what the SEOs have to do. So this is where it is nice to kind of combine the two. So if we're going to look at AngularJS in their implementation summary, everything that I've talked about earlier, to don't use AngularJS on the second version is to use a static equivalent site. And basically, as the main summary there is to use the fragment exclamation point tag, which loads the escape fragment, and 301 redirect it to the static version. The href values point to the static version, and the onClick basically returns to the AngularJS version. Initial static HTML rendering, this is where the AngularJS tags, the content is dynamically added to the DOM, but there's also pre-rendered server-side scripting at the back of it. The links are handled similarly to the static site equivalent. Headless browser pre-rendering, Basically, all the JS code is pre-rendered already, and you need a headless browser running on your server. While the pre-rendering services does the exact same thing, but you don't have to install a headless browser. You have to pay for a service. So when have I experienced some of these? I've never experienced it on the AngularJS. Uh, Most of the time, I've only experienced this with small JavaScript code that's implemented on a site, and then sometimes I could persuade the developer to not use it and just use, simple CSS tricks. But that is not fully applicable for a whole Angular site, and I've never had a client that agreed to that. Now, for the second one, to have a static site equivalent is like having two sites. I've never experienced doing this technique as my first strategy. I've only experienced this from clients that moved over from one company to the company that I'm working on. And since they already invested a lot of time in Angular, they don't want to throw away their site. They don't want to touch it that much. So we make the static equivalent site to save it. Now, my favorite, because there's nothing to install, there's no two sites, it's only one site, but I haven't experienced this a lot also. I only experienced doing this for clients that were either making their site from scratch, it's a new site, or they decided to refactor their site or rebuild or redevelop their site because this requires a lot of development work. So only clients that were willing to throw away their existing site and rebuild it from scratch are the ones that would typically agree to this to build it right. The headless browser, I have seen many clients that have done this, and even from other SEO industry people, industry peers, they prefer the headless browser because you don't have to deal with the code. You don't have to explain to developers how they do it. And let's be honest, not all SEOs really have a development background. So they can't really discuss everything in terms of the code. So just installing the headless browser should fix all the issues because it's going to pre-render the JavaScript code. Now, the only problem with this though is that you have to install the headless browser. Now, I have seen some people that said, I don't want to even bother installing the headless browser. We don't even know how to do that. It's a lot easier to just pay another company. So like prerender.io, it becomes a lot more easier. However, if you have tons and tons and tons of AngularJS pages, the payment you have for the pre-rendering service increases because you're paying by the page. The more pages you have, the more expensive it becomes. And when that happens, there is a tendency to go back to the headless browser because it's cheaper if you have tons and tons of pages. Now, anything with pre-rendering, there's something you have to configure on the server that didn't exist before. Okay? Unlike in the static equivalent initial static rendering, you don't have to install something new. You don't have to configure anything. You could just use the server as is. Now, on the headless browser, what you have to do is install the headless browser. And when you install that headless browser, you have to configure that. In the pre-rendering services, you have to install the middleware. So in the headless browser, you install something. In the pre-rendering service, you pay for something. Now, that mainly ends up the AngularJS portion. The next part would be about the schema microdata.